Author Victor Davis Hanson, senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, gives a lecture on freedom of expression in the U.S. Mr. Hanson argues that America lacks the willingness to fight for the ideals of the Enlightenment. This event, hosted by the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., is almost an hour.
Security and freedom are symbiotic. You cannot have personal freedom unless the state can guarantee the individual freedom from fear or security. And of course, you can't have security, really, unless you have free citizens that take it upon themselves to guarantee peace in the streets, so to speak. And this has been a very tenuous relationship. They're symbiotic and complementary, but they're also antithetical. That being said, it seems to me if we look at 2,500 years of civilization, Western liberal societies have erred a little bit more on the side of freedom than security. The idea was there was the trust in the individual that in extremis and times of crisis they would rally and draw on the collective ingenuity, autonomy, flexibility of a free citizen in the 11th hour. And that theme seems to be with us from the very beginning. And let me just read to you a famous passage in the second book of Thucydides' history, and what Thucydides tells us, at least, or makes words come out of the mouth of Pericles, who addressed this very issue, the supposed antithesis between security and freedom, and the Athenian model versus the unnamed, but we should assume Spartan antithesis. He says to an assembly of the Athenians in the second year of the Peloponnesian War, "We throw open our city to the world, and never by alien acts exclude foreigners from any opportunity of learning or observing. Although the eyes of an enemy may occasionally profit by our liberality, trusting less in system and policy than to the native spirit of our citizens, while in education, where our rivals from their very cradles by a painful discipline seek after manliness, at Athens, in contrast, we live exactly as we please, and yet are just as ready to encounter every legitimate danger." And we can very easily think of examples of both extremes. You could make the argument that 4th century Athens in the world of Demosthenes had erred on the side of liberality, in which freedom had become licensed, so much so that in 338 the Athenians could not stop 30,000 people who threatened the security and autonomy of the city-state coming from the north in a way that their great-grandfathers had easily done with 250,000 Persians. We think of all the problems inherent in 5th century Rome, and they could not provide security for the individual. We think of imperial Rome in a sense of autocratic, but it wasn't so necessarily at the municipality. In many ways, the Republican sense of freedom of the individual still persisted, and yet the state could not ensure security for the individual, and therefore freedom was lost. Perhaps the locus classicus, of course, is France in 1940, with that great army that had lost 6 million civilian casualties and military casualties, but more importantly, that great army had fought so well at Verdun, enshrining Marshal Pétain's famous phrase, or perhaps it was from General Nivelle, "They shall not pass," collapsed in 6 weeks in 1940, which was a product, I think most of us would come to agree, of an ideology that took place and flourished in the 1930s, where politicians such as Mr. Briand or authors like Anatole France had demonized the very name of Verdun, as if World War I had been a terrible accident or miscommunication. In any case, the liberality of which we always associated with French humanism was lost because the state could not provide security. By the same token, we can err in the opposite degree and think of governments in the West that in their zealousness for security or in their duplicity of using security as a means of state coercion erred in the opposite direction. It was Alexander the Great who claimed that he was a champion of the Greek city-state even as he ruined it and denied freedom of the individual. I mentioned earlier that at the national level, the transition in the 1st century AD from republicanism to imperialism in Rome had the same effect, that there was an emphasis on state authoritarianism, security, at the expense of the individual. we and ourselves have had some experience with this. As liberal as we have been in the Civil War, we have suspended the rights of habeas corpus, not just by Abraham Lincoln, but even in the war's aftermath to suppress the Ku Klux Klan. In some ways, the government of Woodrow Wilson in 1917 and 1918 was more antithetical to individual freedom than anything we saw, even with the Japanese internment in World War II, or military tribunals that executed German saboteurs without transparency and without really information about the proceedings given to the public. So we've always had this tension that's inherent within the West. After 9/11, it became relevant again to all of us in a very personal sense with the succession of legislation designed to prevent another stealthy attack on the United States. If we were to summarize that dilemma, I think today if we ask a conservative, he would say that he could not point to any loss of freedom in his everyday life. He can still have access to the library. He can still phone as he pleases. He can still say what he wants. If we were to ask somebody of the liberal persuasion, they would say the Constitution is shredded, and it wasn't worth the price of perhaps, if he would even acknowledge that these measures have somewhat made us more secure, and we have not experienced another 9/11. And so this tension is with us today. And I would like to suggest to you that for maybe the first time in recent memory, the dangers to personal freedom that we're experiencing are not coming from a state apparatus. We are not in worry, I think, today that the CIA is going to wiretap our phones, or what we say here today will be monitored and brought up in a deleterious effect in our later lives. But rather, there is a sense of coercion, and we are insidiously, incrementally losing some of the elements of the Western Enlightenment. But we are doing so not because a government is coercing us, we're doing it to ourselves. Inch by inch, we were giving up pieces of the Enlightenment, protocols of the Enlightenment. Let me give 3 or 4 examples. If we were to talk about novels, fiction, would it be more dangerous for an American author to write a novel describing a hypothetical of killing George Bush, as Nicholson Baker did with Counterpoint a few years ago, published by Alfred Knopf? Did he have more to fear from the state than did Salman Rushdie writing the Satanic Verses about his own safety? Did we create a climate in the West where an author who would caricature or mock radical Islam had more to fear than an author that would, in some sense, envision killing the President of the United States? If we were to turn to the genre of film, if you look at Gabriel Strange's film, a documentary, again, imagining killing George Bush that won an award in Toronto, did he have more to worry from the state that might curtail his freedom of expression in a time of war? Or did someone like Theo van Gogh producing Submission, or Kurt Wilder's Fitna? In other words, did a filmmaker in Europe have more to fear about his free expression from a certain environment, or maybe the state's inability to provide security to someone who wanted to comment in a cinematographical fashion about radical Islam? We can do this with religion as well. Think for a minute. In wartime, if a preacher, a man of the cloth, minister, were to get up in front of his congregation and say, "God damn America," this is the United States of KKK, would he have more to fear from the state curtailing his freedom of expression? Or would the Pope, far more powerful figure, would he have more to fear for the safety of himself and people within his church if he were to reference a 14th century treatise about a Byzantine change of letters with an Ottoman? Would that be more dangerous? Would he have more to fear that either his own Vatican or the Society of European Intellectuals at large or the state apparatus could not provide security, and therefore he would have to be careful after that lecture what he says in the future? So it's not just film, and it's also religion, it's also free expression. We can even finish with an example, if you like, from journalism. In a time of war, would a journalist have more to fear if he wrote an article, as Jonathan Chait did for the New Republic, called "The Case for Bush Hatred"? The first sentence of the essay said, "I hate George Bush." Or would a cartoonist in Denmark have more to fear? And I say this after coming into Europe last night and reading in the European newspapers about an attack on the Danish embassy yesterday in Istanbul in which 6 people, I think, were killed? Or would a journalist have more to fear by publishing a cartoon? So what is going on in the West as we see today? Whom to fear, to rephrase that old biblical phrase? And I think the answer is that right now, at this time, there is a collective mood in the West that is self-censoring, is not self-reflective, and has had a deleterious effect on free expression. And while we have a history of state coercion of the individual, the problem right now is not in the stars, so to speak. It's within ourselves. And we have to ask, why is this happening? I'd like to cite 3 or 4 different ideologies. We could call them, for just the sake of conversation this morning, postmodern ideologies that have had, I think, a corrosive effect on the freedom of expression of the individual. The first, of course, is multiculturalism. This is the confusion between the equality of various cultures versus a multiracial society within the auspices of Western constitutional government. We are a multiracial society that largely abides by the protocols of Western culture, society, and civilization. We confuse that by suggesting that we're simply a menu of equal cultures, which we're not. But that's a popular philosophy and ideology that I think its proponent could best be summarized that no culture could be any worse than the West. It's driven by the engine that the West seems to be more prosperous than the non-West. At least we don't know how long that'll prevail, but at least in the last 200 and 300 years that's been absolutely true. And there is a collective sense in the West that we have some type of obligation to pay the so-called other due to the purported sins which are not the sins of mankind, that innate to all humans as being frail beings, but rather innate to Western civilization: racism, imperialism, homophobia, sexism. And out of that doctrine that was promulgated in the West, especially in the United States, that sort of replaced the melting pot, the multiracial paradigm, a certain mentality has come over that forbids us or prevents us from expressing ourselves freely. In the domestic sense, you can see it very clearly. If I never thought in my lifetime that I would see an African-American minister address the NAACP and in very careful language outline a theory that suggested that all of us, black and white, have different genetic abilities to process information predicated on race, and give that lecture to the silence of presidential candidates, but to the standing applause of the audience, without any note of recrimination from any national observer. Why? Because I think this doctrine suggested that Reverend Wright was going to be judged by a different standard. And when we see it abroad, the multicultural standard suggests, well, because of the sins of the West, we really do not want to apply the same standards to such things as genital circumcision in Sudan, or honor killings on the West Bank, or Sharia law that's taking place in England. We don't want to do that because we either think that we have a bad history in our past of projecting our values in the colonial sense on other peoples, or we feel that multiculturalism is part of the postmodern idea that there is no right or wrong, but that morality is socially constructed, usually defined by those who have power, i.e. the Western group of people. The non-Western doesn't, so therefore they're always subject to the whims and the arbitrary judgments of people who have greater authority and influence. But nevertheless, I think multiculturalism has forbidden people collectively in the West from exercising independent judgment, and especially disdain and censure for some of the things that have been going on, and that has had a chilling effect on free speech. Another doctrine, I guess for want of a better word, I would call it utopian pacifism. Those in the West have always had the notion of a golden age. It's inherent in Greek and Roman culture. The idea that, I guess it's a product of the first classical Enlightenment, but it came into full steam in the 18th century. This notion that man is perfectible, man's nature is not constant, but given Western rationalism, given the greater affluence